This is not a story about the act of betrayal. It's about the silence that comes after, when someone realizes they were underestimated and decides not to warn anyone. My name is Fernanda, and for 14 years I believed I knew the man I married. Not because he was romantic, not because he was affectionate, but because he was always there. Or at least, that's what I thought. Our life wasn't perfect. It never was. We had 2 young daughters, an exhausting routine, bills that never seemed to end, and that constant feeling that the day always finished before everything was truly done. He didn't like talking about feelings. I learned not to insist. He got irritated by questions. I learned to ask fewer. Over time, I confused silence with maturity. I started calling absence a difficult phase. I accepted emotional crumbs as if they were normal. Nothing seemed serious enough to break a family, until the day he didn't come back. At first it wasn't panic, it was just a delay. The girls were already in their pajamas when I sent the first message. "Are you coming for dinner?" There was no reply. I prepared the plates anyway, put his food in the refrigerator, like someone who still believes it makes sense to keep a place at the table. Hours passed. The girls fell asleep. The house grew quiet. I called once, then again. The phone rang until it went to voicemail. That night I barely slept. Not because of suspicion, but because of unease. Something was out of place, even if I couldn't yet name it. The next morning, I woke up early, made breakfast for the girls, took them to school, and came back home with that uncomfortable feeling of living an incomplete day. I called again. Nothing. By the end of the afternoon, fear began to take shape. I called one of his friends, then another. No one knew anything. "Did he mention any trip?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. No one had heard a thing. That night I didn't sleep at all. It wasn't anger, it wasn't jealousy, it was fear. Real fear. I began imagining scenarios I had never considered. An accident, a robbery, something he hadn't been able to warn me about. On the 3rd day, I went to the police station. Saying out loud that my husband was missing was harder than I expected. The word missing carries weight. It opens doors no one wants to walk through. I filled out forms, answered questions, mentally retraced every conversation, every outing, every small detail from the previous weeks. Meanwhile, at home, the girls kept asking, "Where's Dad?" I smiled, lied carefully. He had an emergency. At that moment, I still believed he would come back. I believed everything had a logical explanation I just didn't know yet. I waited. I waited because I thought that's what wives do. I waited because I had young children. I waited because it never crossed my mind that someone could simply erase their life from someone else's. I didn't scream. I didn't make a scene. I didn't accuse anyone. I waited, and without knowing it, that was exactly what he underestimated. I had always worked, even when the girls were little, even when exhaustion felt heavier than the day itself. I never stopped having my own income. A few years earlier, I chose to move to a home office setup. Not out of financial necessity, but by choice. I wanted to be present. I wanted to have lunch with them. I wanted to follow homework, school projects, conversations that only happen when a mother is nearby. My job allowed that. I earned well. I had stability. The house worked because I made it work. But slowly, that started to be treated as something smaller than it was. "You stay home all day," he would say sometimes, half joking, half careless. At first, it didn't bother me. I knew my value. I knew what I had built. But repeated phrases have a strange way of sinking in. When something is said often enough, even casually, it begins to carry weight. He started making decisions without consulting me. Trips, schedules, plans. He didn't ask. He informed. "We'll talk later," became his favorite sentence, and I let it slide. Not because I agreed, but because I was too tired to turn everything into a confrontation. My routine was full. Meetings, deadlines, daughters, house. I balanced everything. Meanwhile, he slowly stepped away from small responsibilities, forgot school commitments, missed important dates, came home late without warning. Nothing dramatic, nothing that justified a direct confrontation. Everything was subtle, silent, as if I were being gently pushed out of the decisions of my own life. Sometimes at night I thought about speaking up, asking if everything was okay, saying I felt left out, but I gave up. There was always something more urgent. A test the next day, an unexpected fever, a work delivery. I prioritized everyone. He seemed comfortable with that. There was never a clear conversation about separation. There was never a serious fight. There was never a goodbye. And that was what hurt the most later. Because looking back, I realized he didn't leave suddenly. He left gradually. And I, trying to keep everything standing, didn't notice that he no longer felt part of the structure. On the day he disappeared, many people asked me if I hadn't seen signs. Signs exist when you know what to look for. At that time, I only saw a tired family trying to survive routine. I didn't beg for attention. I didn't demand presence. I didn't threaten to leave. I kept going. And maybe that was exactly what made him believe I always would, that I would wait, that I would adapt to any absence. He mistook my stability for passivity, my silence for dependence, my choice to work from home for comfort. He didn't understand that I had stopped talking because I was observing. And when you observe in silence, you see everything. After the first week, fear began to change shape. It was no longer that raw, paralyzing panic that tightens the chest and freezes the body. It became something more uncomfortable, more confusing. I still woke up early, still took the girls to school, still worked normally. From the outside, everything looked under control. Inside, something no longer fit. His phone remained unreachable, no messages, no attempts to contact us. But there were details that didn't match a real disappearance. His credit cards hadn't been blocked. There were no strange bank alerts, no calls from hospitals, no follow-ups from the police beyond the initial report. It was as if he had exited the scene, carefully, and that disturbed me more than the silence. I began reviewing small things, old conversations, loose phrases. I remembered comments about travel, a sudden interest in things that had never been part of our life before. A restlessness I had ignored, assuming it was just stress. I didn't talk about this with anyone. People were already looking at me with enough pity. "Any news?" they asked. I smiled, said no. Not because I wanted to hide something, but because I still didn't know what to think. The girls felt his absence in different ways. The youngest asked less. She accepted my short answers. The older one observed more than she spoke. One day while I was making dinner, she came closer and asked, with a calm that broke me, "Is he coming back?" I stopped, took a breath. "I hope so." She nodded, didn't push further. But in her silence, I recognized something familiar. That sense that waiting was no longer comfortable. At night when the house was quiet, I sat alone on the couch and thought about how strange everything felt. There was no anger yet. Still, no anger. There was a growing sense that I was waiting for someone who might not be trying to return, and that idea was hard to face. I began to search, not desperately, carefully. Simple things, public records, digital traces, nothing definitive, nothing explicit, but enough to unsettle me. It was like following footprints that led nowhere, and at the same time suggested someone had walked away on purpose. I didn't confront anyone, didn't call distant relatives, didn't create dramatic theories. I kept observing. At work I managed to stay focused. My professional life had never depended on him. I had my own career, my own contracts, my own rhythm. That gave me a quiet kind of strength. I didn't need immediate answers to survive, but I needed them to understand. And understanding began to matter more than waiting. It was during that time that something inside me shifted. I still missed him. There was still longing, but hope lost its innocence. It stopped being blind waiting. It became attentive waiting. I no longer checked my phone hoping to hear his voice. I checked it to confirm his absence. That was different. I wasn't chasing signs of life anymore. I was noting the lack of them, and without fully realizing it, I started preparing myself for the possibility that the story I thought I knew might already have ended without anyone telling me. He didn't know it yet, but little by little, I was no longer just the woman who waited. I was becoming the woman who observed, and that changes everything. The confirmation didn't come as a shock. It came as something out of place, something too small to justify an emotional outburst, yet too big to ignore. I was at my computer working when I needed to access an old document saved in a shared folder he also used. Nothing personal, nothing investigative, just routine. While browsing the files, I noticed a recent change in an account I hadn't accessed in months. An access outside the usual pattern, outside normal hours, outside the country. At that moment, I didn't feel anger. I felt a slow, precise chill run through my entire body, because that changed everything. Until then, I still accepted the possibility of a serious mishap, something beyond his control. But this wasn't an accident, it was movement. Someone who disappears, doesn't organize logins, doesn't access old accounts, doesn't leave deliberate digital traces. That was the first time I understood. He wasn't unreachable, he was gone by choice. I closed the laptop calmly, stood up, went to the kitchen. I made coffee as if nothing had happened. That was when I realized something important about myself. I didn't need to react immediately for the truth to be real. Truth doesn't demand a spectacle. In the following days, I started paying closer attention, not with desperation, with method. Small confirmations began to appear. Old messages that reread now took on new meaning. A vague sentence about new beginnings, a casual comment about no longer feeling part of it. Nothing explicit, but all too coherent when placed in sequence. I didn't tell anyone, not out of fear, but because I needed to understand on my own. Waiting, which had once been emotional, became rational. I stopped imagining scenarios and started accepting facts. He wasn't trying to come back. He wasn't asking for help. He wasn't in danger. He was moving on. That realization brought something unexpected. Clarity, not relief. Not yet, but clarity. When you understand that someone left by choice, waiting changes its nature. It stops being hope. It becomes delay. And I didn't want to delay my life anymore. The girls continued their routines, school, friends, questions here and there. I kept the house running, worked normally, paid the bills. Nothing had collapsed. And that bothered me too. Because deep down, I realized he had always believed I depended on him more than I actually did. He believed his absence would cause chaos, that I would panic, that everything would freeze until he returned. None of that happened. The silence remained, but it now carried a different weight. It was no longer emptiness. It was a decision being made far away from me. And for the first time, I felt something other than pain. I felt a distance forming. I was still married, officially, but I no longer felt part of the same story. Something had ended without notice, and I was beginning to accept that. That night, after the girls went to sleep, I sat alone in the living room, lights off, watching the reflection of the street on the window. I didn't cry. I didn't make lists. I didn't call anyone. I just thought, if he managed to leave our life without looking back, maybe I needed to stop watching the door. That was when waiting lost its meaning. And even without knowing the full truth yet, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. He hadn't disappeared. He had chosen to live another story. And without realizing it, he had underestimated the one thing he never should have underestimated: my ability to continue. The confirmation didn't come as a confession. It came as a series of coincidences that stopped feeling like coincidences. There was no unexpected phone call, no one knocking at the door. It was information that arrived indirectly, passed along by others. The kind that comes without intention, but changes everything. A mutual acquaintance mentioned, almost casually, that he had been seen outside the country months earlier. Nothing specific, nothing accusatory. Maybe he went to take care of something, she said, trying to be helpful. I nodded, thanked her, changed the subject. But inside, that sentence fit perfectly into the puzzle that had been forming in silence. Months earlier, while I slept badly, while the girls asked questions, while I registered a disappearance, Months earlier, he had already chosen another direction. I spent that night awake, not from anxiety, but from clarity. It was as if my mind had finally been allowed to organize what my heart had been postponing. I mentally replayed our last conversations, the distancing, the vague comments about needing space, the way he slowly disconnected from the girl's routine. Nothing had been abrupt. He didn't break things off, he slipped away, and in doing so, he assumed something I only understood later. He believed I would stay exactly where he left me. He thought I would spend my life waiting for news. He thought I would live suspended in his absence. He thought my stability was disguised dependence. He underestimated me, not because he thought I was weak, but because he never bothered to truly see me. The next morning, I took the girls to school like always. Made coffee, opened my computer, I worked, met deadlines, joined meetings, signed contracts. My life didn't pause because his continued without me, and that was a silent shock. Not for me, but for the idea he had of me. For the first time, I considered something that once felt unthinkable. I didn't need to wait anymore. Wait for what? An explanation that might never come? A return that no longer made sense? I hadn't been abandoned dramatically. I had been discarded carefully, and that hurt in a different way. At that point, I still didn't know all the details. I didn't know names, I didn't know faces, I didn't know intentions, but I knew the essential truth. He hadn't disappeared. He was living another story, a story that didn't include me, or the girls, or the life we had built together. That was when the underestimation became clear. He thought I would stay small, that I would collapse, that I wouldn't have the strength to reorganize everything on my own. He thought his silence would paralyze me, but silence did the opposite. It gave me space to think, to decide, to avoid impulsive reactions. I didn't call to confront him. I didn't send long messages. I didn't make accusations. I observed, and by observing, I realized there was nothing left to save in that form. If you've ever been underestimated like this, as if your life depended on someone else's decision, subscribe. Here, stories don't end where someone else thinks they do. That night, after the girls were asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper. Not to write a letter, not to vent, to organize. I listed what depended on me, what I could control, what needed to change. It wasn't revenge, it was reorganization. I wasn't planning to surprise him or prove anything. I was planning to move forward. And moving forward at that moment was the most powerful decision I could make. There wasn't enough anger for a scandal. There was enough clarity for a quiet ending. I understood that his absence hadn't been an accident. It had been a choice. And faced with that, I could choose too. Choose not to beg, not to chase, not to live suspended in a story that had already taken another path. That was when I stopped being the woman who waited, without announcements, without goodbyes, without an audience. He still believed I was standing in the same place, but I had already taken the first step. And when someone takes that step in silence, the return no longer leads to the same address. I always thought absence was what hurt the most. For weeks, I believed the hardest part of that story was the silence, the waiting, the lack of answers. But one day I realized it wasn't. What hurt wasn't his absence, it was the expectation. And when that expectation ended, something inside me reorganized itself. The confirmation came through social media, not through investigation, not through obsession. The photos simply appeared. Recent, current, taken far from here. There was no explanatory caption, no hidden apology between beautiful words. It was just an image, but that image said everything. He was fine. He was smiling. He was moving on. And strangely, in that moment, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel jealousy. I didn't feel the urge to confront him. I felt relief, because there, without any room for doubt, it became clear. He wasn't confused. He wasn't lost. He wasn't trying to come back. He had chosen another story, and that was when I discovered something that surprised me. His absence no longer hurt. It hurt before. when I still believed there was a maybe, when I was still waiting for an explanation, a return, a gesture. But faced with evidence, the maybe died, and with it, the pain changed shape. I closed the app, put my phone away, took a deep breath, and I made a decision. If he ever wanted to come back, there would no longer be a harbor. Not out of revenge, not out of wounded pride, but because I couldn't keep living as if my life were a temporary place, waiting for someone else to decide whether they would stay. The house we lived in had always been mine. Even before the marriage, before the promises, before the family we built, it carried too many memories, too much silence, too many doors I no longer wanted to watch. So I decided to move, not just rearrange furniture, change the address of my story. I put the house up for sale, organized everything calmly, without drama. The girls were part of the process. We chose together what to take and what to leave behind. I explained that change is not escape, it's choice. We moved to another place, another neighborhood, another routine, not to forget, but to stop being stuck. If he had restarted his life, I would restart mine too. And for that, I didn't need anyone else. For now, it was enough to have myself and my daughters. Life went on. Work, school, small discoveries. I didn't talk about him, didn't ask, didn't follow, until some time later he came back, as if nothing had happened. A short message, a familiar tone, almost casual, as if there was still a place waiting for him. But there wasn't. The harbor he knew no longer existed. The house was gone. The routine had changed. And when he finally showed up, it wasn't me who opened the door. It was someone else. Not because I was absent, but because I had moved forward. He came back as if time had stood still. There was no carefully crafted apology, no detailed explanation, no real acknowledgement of what he had done. There was only an attempt to resume, a simple message, a familiar tone, almost too comfortable. We need to talk. The sentence assumed there was still an intact us, just waiting for a conversation to be restored. But there wasn't. When he realized I was no longer at the same address, his surprise was clear. Not spoken out loud, but evident in the way he reacted. He asked where I was, why I had moved, when it had happened. Late questions. I answered calmly, without irony, without exaggerated emotion. I explained that I had moved on, that I had reorganized my life, that the girls were doing well. He seemed confused, as if he couldn't understand when he had lost the place he always believed was reserved for him. "You could have told me," he said. That was when I understood the depth of the underestimation. He thought I needed his permission to move forward, thought my decisions depended on his return, thought silence meant waiting. It didn't. I didn't explain everything, didn't revisit the past, didn't list his absences. That conversation wasn't about old mistakes, it was about present boundaries. I said only what was essential. When you left without saying anything, I had to move forward without consulting you. There was no argument, no tears. What there was a new discomfort for him, not being at the center anymore. He tried to get closer to the girls, tried to reclaim some form of routine. I didn't prevent it, but I didn't make it easy beyond what was necessary. Things now had clear rules, schedules, emotional distance. Nothing was done as punishment, everything was done as reality. He slowly realized he no longer had unrestricted access to my life, nor to my decisions, nor to my time. What used to be automatic now required respect, and that bothered him more than any argument ever would have, because he couldn't accuse me of aggression, couldn't say I was exaggerating, couldn't place himself as the victim. I was too calm for that. When someone expects an explosive reaction and finds serenity instead, the impact is deeper. He tried to act as if everything could be resumed naturally, as if simply being present again would fix things. But late presence doesn't repair prolonged absence. And for the first time, he understood that returning doesn't mean recovering. Coming back doesn't guarantee access. Coming back doesn't erase choices. The life I rebuilt wasn't designed to welcome him back. It was built to move forward, without noise, without public announcements, without the need to prove anything. I didn't need to say he had lost. Reality did that on its own. He left that conversation different from how he entered it, less certain, less secure of his place. And I stayed exactly where I was, whole, not because I defeated someone, but because I stopped shrinking myself to fit into absences. That was when the turn was completed, without scandal, without an audience, without revenge, just with the quiet certainty that some doors, when closed in silence, do not reopen with late explanations. After he walked away from that conversation, life didn't change dramatically. There was no cinematic turnaround, no sense of victory. There was something better, there was peace. In the days that followed, I noticed I no longer thought about him when I woke up. I didn't reread old messages. I didn't imagine conversations that never happened. He had stopped occupying space inside me. That didn't happen because he returned. It happened because I had already left long before. The girls adapted in a way that surprised me. Not because they didn't feel their father's absence, but because the house had stopped being a place of silent tension. They laughed more. They slept better. They talked about school with ease. Emotional stability returned quietly, almost invisibly. I kept my routine, work, responsibilities, moments just for us. I didn't feel alone, I felt sufficient. He tried to stay in touch sporadically, sometimes more present, sometimes distant. None of that unsettled me anymore, because there was now a clear boundary between his role as a father and the role he would never again have as a partner. And this boundary was never spoken aloud. It was lived. When someone loses access, they realize too late that what sustained the bond was never obligation. It was choice. And I had stopped choosing. It took him time to understand. Not because he was incapable, but because he had never imagined that ending. He believed there would always be a place to return to, that it would be enough to show up, that the story would continue from where it had paused. But stories don't work that way when one side learns how to walk alone. I didn't need to say there was no more space. The absence of invitation said everything. There was no coffee waiting, no shared routine, no available intimacy. There was respect, and only that. He realized I wasn't cold, I was distant, and emotional distance can't be overcome with occasional presence. There was no desperate attempt to win me back. There was silent frustration, that uncomfortable realization that the place he thought was guaranteed no longer existed. I didn't feel pleasure in that, nor guilt. I felt closure. Some people only learn when the consequence doesn't shout, when it simply settles in. He followed his life. I followed mine, without competition, without comparison, each of us occupying the space we chose. Today, when I look back, I don't see this story as a tragedy. I see it as a turning point. I discovered that absence wasn't what hurt. What hurt was the expectation that someone would choose to stay. When that expectation disappeared, everything became lighter. I didn't need to prove strength. I didn't need to defeat anyone. I simply stopped staying where I was no longer considered. Some people mistake silence for weakness. They mistake stability for dependence. They mistake patience for permanent availability. And they are wrong. Because there comes a moment when silence stops waiting and starts deciding. Some people only recognize value when they no longer have access. And when they do, the door is no longer there. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Stories We Tell, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us keep creating stories about strength, self-respect, and new beginnings, because stories that restore dignity deserve to be told and remembered. Thank you for being here.